The first time I saw one of the sick go bad, I was standing on the curb outside Union Passenger Terminal in New Orleans, with a shoulder camera digging into my right side and sweat running down my back under the press vest nobody ever wore unless there had been a storm. We were supposed to be getting street footage for the evening block. That was all. A rough flu cluster, city shelters filling up, bus passengers coughing on each other. Maybe a city health warning if the mayor decided to show his face. That was the pitch from the desk. Keep it tight. Film masks, medics, buses, worried families, all the usual stuff. Instead, I watched a woman wrapped in a saint's blanket drop to her knees by the taxi lane, cough up thick green spit onto the concrete, grab a stranger by the ankle, and bite clean through the fabric of his pant leg before anybody near her understood what was happening. The problem was not just that she attacked him, it was how fast the whole sidewalk changed after that. The man she grabbed started yelling and trying to kick free. His wife thought he was having a seizure and bent down to help. A porter rushed over with one of those yellow floor signs from inside because he had no clue what else to do. My reporter stepped toward the scene because that is what reporters do when something goes from weird to real. I was already rolling. You learn after enough hurricanes and shootings that the first 30 seconds matter more than the next 30 minutes. Then the woman stood up too fast for a person who had just collapsed, swung both arms blind, and smashed into the little line of people waiting for the Baton Rouge bus. One scream set off 10 more. A security guard reached for her shoulder. She drove her forehead into his mouth hard enough to put both of them on the ground. The station did not cut away. They wanted more. I had one ear on the scene and one ear on the return line from the truck. Keep framing. Stay wide. Get the medics. Get the police. Do not lose the bus doors. Then a man stumbled out of the terminal, holding his neck and coughing into both hands. Green across his palms. Not bright, not movie stuff, just that ugly yellow-green you see when a chest infection has gone deep and ugly. He ran 3 steps, slammed into the side of a Greyhound coach, turned, and started clawing at the people closest to him. Not swinging with purpose, just grabbing skin, hair, shirt collars, whatever he could reach. That was when the crowd stopped acting like a crowd and started acting like trapped animals. Everyone surged at once. Bags went everywhere. Kids got separated from parents in one push. One of the glass doors on the terminal front cracked from bodies hitting it from both directions. My reporter never got her first sentence out. She had the mic up, took one step back, and somebody hit her from behind hard enough to send her into my camera shoulder. I almost dropped the rig. She hit the pavement on her side and rolled into the gutter. People ran over the mic cable. One man in a hotel shirt stepped on her wrist without even seeing her. I dragged her by the arm toward the truck while still filming, because my head had not caught up to my hands yet. That is a nasty thing to admit, but it is the truth. The camera was on my shoulder and the lens was still pointed at the sidewalk, and I was getting clean footage of shoes, knees, dropped backpacks, a little girl screaming for her father, and a city bus driver trying to shut his doors on people still halfway through them. When I got her behind the truck, she was conscious, cursing, and bleeding from a split above her eyebrow. That should have been enough for me to stop right there and get her out. Instead, the assignment desk came through in my ear yelling that every station in town was now calling it a riot, and they needed me back up front. That was the moment the whole job changed for me. Not because the desk was wrong to want the pictures. Pictures mattered. The moment changed because I realized nobody in the building downtown had any idea what was actually happening on that curb. They were working from delay, from monitors, from routine. I was standing 10 yards from people who had gone from feverish and weak to violent in less time than it takes to read a weather teaser. I locked my reporter in the passenger seat, handed her a bottle of water and a clean rag from the gearbox, and went back out with the camera and the bonded cellular pack. Police were arriving from the Poydras side, not enough of them. 4 units, then 6, then more. A transit supervisor was trying to shout bus numbers over the screaming. 2 medics had one of the bitten men pinned by the shoulders, and he was still fighting them even though one side of his face was swelling fast. He kept trying to spit. That stood out to me. Not words, not pain, not confusion. Spitting. He was trying to get fluid on them. One medic took a glob on the cheek shield, and both of them recoiled so hard they nearly lost him. I tracked that right into a close shot without thinking. The city called it a severe behavioral incident tied to respiratory distress before we had even left the curb. That line came out while I was still filming luggage scattered in the roadway and people climbing over the low barrier toward Loyola Avenue. Severe behavioral incident. I heard it in my ear and wanted to laugh, but it was not funny. Behind that language, there were already at least 7 people on the ground. One cop using his baton against a man in hospital scrubs, and a woman standing in the middle of the lane with a wheeled suitcase still in her hand, while she coughed so hard she bent at the waist and pissed herself in front of everybody. Nobody went near her because by then, folks had started to understand something simple. Anybody showing signs could flip fast. We were sent next to University Medical Center on Tulane Avenue because emergency traffic there had doubled in under an hour. That drive took us through blocks that still looked normal from a distance. Cars at red lights. Streetcars stopped. People outside bars checking phones. The usual New Orleans afternoon haze sitting over the roofs. Then you got close to the hospital, and it was a different world. Ambulances stacked in the bay. Private cars parked halfway over curbs. Families carrying sick relatives in through the side doors because they thought they could skip triage that way. I parked on the Canal Street side and grabbed the camera again. My reporter stayed in the truck that time, head wrapped, not steady enough to stand. So I went in alone. The smell hit before the noise did. Disinfectant, sweat, vomit, and that wet hospital air from overworked cooling units. Security had pushed everyone into lanes with plastic crowd control barriers. Green tape marked respiratory intake. Yellow tape marked contact exposures. Red tape was supposed to be for aggression risk, but there were already too many people for the colors to mean anything. Nurses were using face shields, gowns, and whatever masks they had left. I saw one tech with a painter's respirator from a hardware store and a Sharpie name tag on the strap. In the waiting area, a kid was asleep on 3 chairs, while his father sat beside him with a towel over his mouth and blood on his knuckles from fighting somebody for a place in line. I got inside because the hospital public information woman recognized the station logo on my vest and thought I was there with an official camera pool. That kind of mistake still mattered in those first hours. People still believed there would be a managed message, one controlled feed, one calm explanation. She told me I could film from the back wall and only from the back wall. She said the symptoms were acute fever, heavy coughing, airway inflammation, confusion, and in some patients, a sudden neurobehavioral spike. That was the phrase she used, neurobehavioral spike. Then right behind her, a man in his 40s came up off a gurney with 2 restraints already on him and drove his shoulder into a respiratory therapist so hard both of them crashed into the med cart. I filmed a tray of syringes skidding across tile while the public information woman ducked and swore and forgot I was even there. One doctor stopped long enough to talk because he thought the camera might finally scare the state into sending what they needed. He said the chest scans looked bad but inconsistent. Some lungs looked almost clear, some looked full of patchy infiltration, and it did not line up cleanly with how sick the person looked. The thing that scared him was the timing. Patients were arriving short of breath, febrile, exhausted, then hitting a sharp turn where the oxygen dropped, agitation spiked, and impulse control disappeared. He said it was not ordinary delirium. He had seen delirium. This was aggression with motor drive still intact. People strong enough to sprint, grab, climb, bite, and keep going after injury. He said if it spread well before that phase showed, emergency departments would stop functioning first, then transport, then law enforcement. That doctor was right. By the time I got back to the truck, the station was already asking for footage from other sites because the same pattern was being reported at the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center intake hall, at 2 church shelters in Gentilly, and at a senior apartment block in Metairie, where families had put sick relatives in one common room to keep an eye on them. Keep an eye on them. That phrase got a lot of people hurt. The problem with a fast neurologic phase is that you stop thinking of a coughing relative as a threat until he is already on his feet coming at you. We headed toward the convention center because the mayor's office had announced that a supervised medical overflow area was being built there. I knew before we got close that it was not supervised enough. Convention Center Boulevard was jammed 3 blocks out. City buses, school buses, private vans, church shuttles, pickup trucks with mattresses thrown in the bed, all of it stuck in one slow knot along the curb while volunteers waved clipboards that had already become useless. There were portable toilets lined up by the wall, pallets of water under torn plastic, and families sitting on suitcases in the shade because the line inside was longer than the line out. Somebody had run extension cords to box fans, and those fans were blowing the same hot breath and cough air across everybody standing there shoulder to shoulder. That was the moment the scale of it hit me. Not the violence, the math. Even if only a small fraction of those people flipped, there was nowhere for the rest to go that would not feed the thing harder. I stayed on the perimeter at first, getting wide shots of intake, medics, National Guard trucks pulling up from Chapatulas, all the standard signs of a city trying to hold a line. Then the line failed in the dumbest way possible. A volunteer tried to move one coughing man from the family queue to the symptomatic queue. His wife thought they were separating them for good. She started yelling. 2 more people joined in because they had been in line for hours already and saw any movement as cheating. A folding table tipped. The guard detail on that door shifted toward the shouting. While every set of eyes turned to the argument, 3 sick people near the fan bank went into that same sharp, violent phase almost together. One climbed onto a crate of bottled water and launched himself at the nearest medic. Another sprinted straight into the stroller lane. The panic there was worse than at the bus station, because there were more children and more people already half exhausted. I remember filming one National Guardsman trying not to fire, while a woman with foam and spit all over her shirt beat both fists against his face shield. He kept shoving her back with the stock of his M4, trying to stay off the trigger, looking over his shoulder for an order that nobody had time to give. Beside him, another soldier was pulling a mother and 2 kids through a staff door, while a volunteer got knocked flat and trampled by the people who thought that door was an exit for them too. I saw one of the fan cords get ripped loose. The whole bank went dead. Heat folded in on the crowd all at once. By then, the station was not even pretending this was a flu story with some panic attached. The producer, who had been acting tough all afternoon, came over my earpiece, breathing hard, and told me straight that every newsroom in the state was trying to figure out whether to send more crews or pull the ones already out. Baton Rouge had disturbances at the River Center intake. Lafayette had hospital security using tasers in their ambulance bay. Lake Charles had a bus from Houston diverted because 3 passengers turned violent on Interstate 10 west of the Atchafalaya approach. The words were changing on air, but the instinct in the buildings had not changed yet. They still believed coverage and control were separate jobs. On the ground, they were already the same job. The camera got you access until it got you killed. I made one more live stand-up that evening with nobody on camera but me. Just my voice over the footage because my reporter was in the truck with dizziness and a swelling wrist. The station wanted a calm summary. I gave them the plainest version I could manage. Crowded intake sites were not safe. Symptomatic people were deteriorating fast. Any shelter mixing respiratory cases, children, and untrained volunteers was going to break. The desk cut me off twice and asked if I could soften the language because state officials were still using the term isolated spikes. I told them isolated was a lie. Then I said it on air. I said the lines were too dense, the case counts were behind, and the routes being advertised as relief channels were likely feeding spread into every parish taking buses. That was the first time I got pulled aside by a public official for saying what I had just seen. A city health spokesman in rolled-up sleeves came to the truck with a police lieutenant and asked who had authorized me to describe transmission patterns on air. I told him nobody had to authorize my eyes. He said irresponsible reporting could trigger movement, and movement was the enemy right now. That part was true. Mass movement was a disaster. The problem was he was still talking as if movement had not already started. You could hear it on the scanner and see it on every overpass. Families were leaving shelters before nightfall because word had spread that cough wards were turning into bite wards. People were driving toward relatives in other parishes because they thought fewer bodies meant safer ground. Every route out of New Orleans was already loading up. Around dark, we were ordered to Baton Rouge to support the main state team because one of their crews had lost their transmission pack in a crowd surge near the river center. We took Interstate 10 west across the Bonnet Carré spillway, with our fuel tank a little above half, and every bridge approach lit up red with brake lights. I had never seen that stretch move so slow without a storm behind it. There were people on the shoulder changing tires, loading gas cans, arguing through open windows, calling relatives, checking maps as if maps still meant much. An ambulance tried to get through near Laplace and no one could clear a lane because folks had packed both shoulders too. You could feel the state unclipping one buckle at a time. At first, the sick were hidden inside the traffic, a cough in one SUV, a guy leaning out of a truck vomiting over the side, a child crying in the back seat of a minivan while the mother fanned him with a church flyer. Then the road itself started catching the infection. A compact car 2 lanes over drifted into the median cable after the driver slumped forward. A pickup ahead of us stopped dead and both rear doors flew open. One teenage boy jumped out and started beating on the passenger window with both hands because the man inside was trying to grab him through the opening. Nobody got out to help. That sounds cold. It was not cold. It was survival math. By then, people had learned that close contact with a panicked sick person could put you down in seconds. We got boxed in near the spillway where state police had started moving cars off at random to create a passage for emergency units. The trooper who came to our window looked 19 years old and already wrecked. Sweat salt-dried white on his vest. He checked the press placard, asked if we had seen any aggressive patients in our vehicle, and told us there was a screening point being built closer to Gonzales, where they planned to separate obvious cases from family groups before moving anyone onward. I asked him how many med teams they had. He looked at me, then at the road behind us, and said, "Not enough to matter." That was the first fully honest official answer I heard that day. We rolled into Baton Rouge late enough that the city felt wrong, but not dead. Restaurants still had lights. Gas stations still had lines instead of fights. Traffic signals still worked. Then we got downtown and hit the River Center staging area, and it was the same disaster with better lighting. The difference was the state had layered more authority onto it. More troopers, more guard trucks, more barriers, bigger floodlights, more loudspeaker instructions. That made it look organized until you listened. Half the speakers were giving contradictory directions. One line was for respiratory screening, one for family reunification, one for transport north, one for medication refills, one for no one knew what because the sign was handwritten and already crossed out twice. I left the truck by the Mississippi Riverside and walked the perimeter with the camera low, because the mood there had shifted from fear to anger. In New Orleans, people were still asking for help. In Baton Rouge, people were demanding answers, rides, medicine, separation from the sick, confirmation that their parish still had power, confirmation that schools would open, confirmation that rumors about the airport were false. Nobody in a uniform could give them all that. I saw one state employee with a laptop and a fold-out table trying to log evacuee names while 2 women screamed at him over a battery charger. Beside that table, a man in a refinery work shirt sat on the pavement coughing into his elbow while his wife begged everyone not to send him into the red zone because he had not turned mean yet. The red zone was a line of white tents that had gone up in the River Center parking lot. Portable oxygen, cots, IV poles, security on every entry. It looked functional from a distance. Up close, it was already slipping. The intake team was tagging too many people off respiratory signs alone because the state had not come up with a clean predictor for the aggression phase. Some folks with fever and cough would stay weak. Some would crash. Some would spike and attack with no warning besides a few seconds of staring and that rough breathing sound I started noticing all over the state. The guard at the tent flap told me 2 medics had been injured inside in under an hour, and they were short on restraints. Short on restraints. That was where Louisiana was by the end of the first night. The event that blew Baton Rouge open happened just after midnight, and it had nothing to do with infected people climbing fences or some big dramatic breach. It was paperwork and pressure, and human beings reaching a point where they stopped following instructions that no longer matched what they were seeing. The state announced over loudspeakers that transport north would begin soon for screened family groups. That word soon lit the place on fire. Families who had been standing for 6 hours surged toward the outbound lanes. Security tried to hold them. Somebody in the front shouted that the buses were already full of sick people. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was rumor. It did not matter. The movement started. Barriers tipped. A child went down. A trooper drew his pistol, saw the crowd, and holstered it again because even he knew a firearm was useless in that crush. Then, 3 men in the respiratory queue turned bad in the middle of that push. I did not see the very first second because I was filming the barrier line. I heard it. A hard, wet, choking sound. Then a woman yelling, "He is biting me!" Then the whole nearest section of bodies buckled sideways. One of the men charged into the family lane with an IV catheter still taped to his hand. Another grabbed a trooper by the collar and dragged him down into the legs of the people behind him. In a space that tight, you did not need 10 aggressive infected. You needed 2. 2 was enough to make everyone think there were 20. The outbound buses never loaded. Half the people ran back toward downtown. The other half spilled into the roads and parking decks around the river. I stayed until a producer called and told me the station had cut regular programming statewide. No sports, no weather wheel, no overnight replays. Just emergency coverage and official briefings stitched together with live field reports. My job from that point on was not to get the perfect picture. It was to stay mobile and keep talking. The camera still mattered because video could prove what some officials kept trying to shrink into numbers, but audio was what people were actually consuming now. In cars, in dark kitchens, in shelters, through phones with cracked screens and weak batteries. So I clipped the camera mic closer, kept the truck charger running, and started speaking longer than cameramen usually speak. There was nobody else left at half the sites anyway. The governor came on sometime after 1 in the morning and used the phrase, "extraordinary public health emergency." He confirmed aggressive neurological symptoms in a subset of cases. He asked residents to shelter in place unless directed by authorities. He warned against contact with bodily fluids. He asked hospitals to activate surge protocols and asked the federal government for support. What he did not say was that multiple parishes were already losing control of the separation problem. People were not choosing between staying home and going out. A lot of them had no safe home left because the apartment block elevator was shared, the hallway was shared, the shelter was shared, the bus was shared, the waiting room was shared. The outbreak was riding every place ordinary working people had to stack themselves to get through a normal day. By dawn the next morning, there were roadblocks on Interstate 12 near Denham Springs, and reports of improvised screening lanes on U.S. Highway 61. We headed east first because somebody had to go back through the lakeside communities and see what was happening outside the big official sites. The causeway was restricted. Slidell had reports of family violence calls spiking all night. A church shelter near Mandeville had shut its doors after one of the volunteers got attacked while distributing breakfast trays. You could hear how fast public language had changed on the scanner. Nobody was saying disturbed subject anymore. Nobody was saying disorderly patient. Dispatchers were saying aggressive infection case and contact risk and do not engage without face protection. In Kenner, I filmed a strip mall parking lot that looked quiet until you listened. Car alarms pulsing, store generators, helicopters overhead heading toward the airport. A pharmacy window punched out. Shopping carts full of bottled water and canned soup abandoned between cars because somebody had either fled or been taken. At a gas station on Williams Boulevard, the pumps were still on, but the clerk had locked the doors and was taking cash through the drawer slit only. He told me the first bad case he saw, there was a guy who seemed drunk until the coughing started. Then the man started slamming his own forehead into the cooler glass because he could not get at the water fast enough. 2 customers tried to hold him down, both left with bites on the forearm through their sleeves. Louis Armstrong Airport was a mess from the access roads outward. The federal message had not caught up to what people were doing. Flights were delayed, then canceled, then rescheduled, then canceled again, while families kept coming because every rumor said something different. Get out now. Do not travel. Domestic is still open. International is shut. Military flights are leaving. Cargo planes are taking evacuees. Most of it was nonsense. What was real was the jam on the approach roads and the line of people outside one terminal entrance waiting for enhanced screening that could not possibly handle the volume. Masks on, bags at their feet, kids asleep on suitcases, old people on folding stools, coughing, bouncing under the awning, while a handful of officers tried to spot symptoms from too far away. I did not stay at the airport long because it had that same bad shelter math I had seen at the convention center, only with more enclosed air and more people convinced motion itself was safety. We turned north again, then west, chasing reports that the state was moving toward regional hardpoints instead of open movement. Camp Beauregard near Pineville was being mentioned. So was the Cajun Dome in Lafayette, though nobody could confirm if it was intake, quarantine, or just rumor. Along the interstate, the signs still flashed normal traffic safety messages in some places and emergency health instructions in others, because the state had not yet unified them. One board told you to buckle up. The next one told you to avoid all physical contact with symptomatic persons and call emergency services before arrival. The hardest thing to get across on air that second day was that the outbreak did not make every sick person violent right away, and it did not make every violent event an outbreak event. Louisiana was still full of ordinary chaos, too. Heat injuries, traffic wrecks, looting, domestic fights, power complaints, folks arguing over motel rooms, a man pulling a pistol at a gas pump because somebody cut the line. Then, layered inside that, there was the infection, moving faster than the paperwork, making some people crash into pure dangerous impulse with enough strength left to spread it further. If you got sloppy and described everything as one big wave, people stopped trusting you. So I kept it plain. Not everybody coughing is going to attack. Not every aggressive person is infected. But enough infected are turning violent that crowding with strangers is now a direct survival risk. Near Hammond, we found the first full roadside screening site that looked half serious. State police cruisers angled across one lane, orange cones, portable lights, a line of National Guard Humvees, medics behind clear face shields doing fast visual assessment through car windows. The problem there was the same problem everywhere else. A road is not a clinic. Families lied because they were scared of separation. Men hid fevers so they would not lose their kids. Women stuffed coughing toddlers under blankets when the line moved forward. Some drivers accelerated through the cones the second a medic asked a hard question. One sedan tried it while I was filming and clipped a barrier, spun, and got pinned by 2 guard trucks before it reached the ramp. The back seat had 3 children in it, and the mother was biting the inside of her own wrist hard enough to bleed. That image stayed with me because it broke the clean story a lot of people wanted. Folks listening at home wanted heroes and monsters by then. Sick and well. Safe and unsafe. The truth was rougher. The woman in that sedan had enough self-control left to try not to get at her kids. She was fighting herself while the driver kept yelling that he could get them to Jackson if people would just move. Medics had to take the children out one at a time while the father kept insisting she had just panicked and was not infected. Then she lunged at a medic with that half-suffocating gasp I had started to hate, and the lie was over. That family was not evil. That family was trapped between love, denial, and a disease that moved faster than their ability to adapt. Sometime in the afternoon of the second day, the unofficial name locked in. Green flu. Not because any lab had confirmed influenza, not because the state endorsed it. It stuck because people on the ground needed a fast, ugly term for the thing that was emptying buses and turning triage lines into fights. Nurses said it. Troopers said it. Gas station clerks said it. The producers finally stopped correcting callers who used it because callers were not going to say acute neurorespiratory event. They were going to say, the green flu got my cousin. The green flu shut the shelter. The green flu is on our block. That name helped people talk fast, but it hurt too, because flu sounded familiar, and familiar got people careless. This thing was not familiar. Not in speed, not in behavior, not in how hard it punished crowding. Lafayette was the first place I saw a city try to get ahead of the violence phase instead of react to it. The Cajun Dome lot had been split into outer screening, family holding, and hard isolation with chain-link temporary fencing and a one-way vehicle pattern. Deputies were walking the lanes with long poles fitted with loop restraints, the same kind animal control uses, but heavier. That looked brutal on camera until you understood why. Close, hands-on restraint was getting responders bit. A nurse at the site told me they had learned from videos out of New Orleans and Baton Rouge that once a patient showed that fixed stare and rapid chest pull, you needed distance fast. She had bruises on both forearms and green stains dried on her gown from a man who had coughed directly into her neck seal that morning. Even that better setup was struggling by sunset. Supplies were coming in, but not in the right mix. Too many blankets, not enough face shields, pallets of bottled water, not enough sedatives, plenty of gloves in sizes nobody needed, not enough portable oxygen. Fold-out cots with no secure isolation space for somebody who could go from weak to combative in under a minute. A lot of emergency management in this country assumes patients want to be patients. That was the deep failure point here. These patients were not staying put. They were fighting during the exact window when responders needed precision most. That made every ordinary logistical miss worse. One missing strap, one bad barrier angle, one volunteer who stepped too close. That was enough to crack a whole line. The station got confirmation that federal help was moving, but it was already too late for the version of help most people imagined. You do not fix a fast-moving behavioral outbreak by dropping a few extra doctors into a state where transport routes are clogged, emergency rooms are bleeding staff, and half the public still thinks official numbers describe the real size of the thing. Those numbers were garbage by the end of day 2. They were only counting tested admissions in places still reporting. I had footage from 3 separate sites where aggressive patients were loaded into private trucks and driven off by relatives who wanted no state involvement. Nobody was counting those. Nobody was counting the dead in locked apartments where neighbors were too scared to check. Nobody was counting the ones who bit a family member, then got tied to a chair in a back room because the family could not accept what had happened. That night, we doubled back toward Baton Rouge because the state had set a media pool at a screening complex off Airline Highway. We never made it there. Interstate 12 westbound froze outside Livingston Parish after a chain wreck, and word spread car to car that a relief convoy had been overrun farther down. I never confirmed the convoy part. What I can confirm is what I saw when I got out with the camera. Families standing beside vehicles in the dark because the heat inside was worse than the road. A man with a flashlight walking from car to car asking for pediatric fever reducer. 2 teenage boys dragging coolers down the shoulder from an abandoned bait shop. A woman kneeling on the asphalt beside a pickup while her husband in the bed hammered both fists against the toolbox lid and begged her not to come closer. I used the truck speaker to tell the cars near us what the nurse in Lafayette had told me. If the sick start staring, breathing hard, and losing speech, get distance now. Window up, door shut, face covered. Do not try to reason through it. Do not pin a grown adult in a small space unless you have no other option. People listened because there was nothing else to listen to. That is the strange thing about a voice once systems start slipping. Folks who would laugh at you on an ordinary Tuesday will follow every word if the world around them is making less sense than your tone does. I did not feel powerful saying any of it. I felt scared because half of what I knew had come from seeing people get hurt right in front of me. Around midnight, gunfire started somewhere ahead of the pileup. Not a battle. A few shots, then silence, then two more. The sound moved across the trapped lanes faster than any official statement could. Everybody ducked. Everybody thought the worst. What had happened, from what I later pieced together, was a deputy trying to stop an aggressive infected driver who had gotten out of a van and attacked a medic working the shoulder. The deputy fired when the man would not stop. In normal times, that would have been one tragic use of force incident. In that traffic, it became rumor fuel for 100 cars. People started reversing onto the shoulder. Others bailed off the embankment and tried to turn around in wet grass. One RV got stuck axle deep and blocked 2 more lanes by itself. I stayed on air most of that night from the cab, with the camera battery chargers humming and the dashboard glowing on low power mode. The station piped me straight through for long stretches because there were no polished anchors left in the building. Too many staff had gone home, too many could not get in, too many were dealing with family, and too many were scared to sit in one newsroom with central air and shared bathrooms. So it was me, a field cameraman who had spent years making sure other people were framed well, now talking into a mic while describing the shape of a state coming apart by increments. Not on one dramatic blast, by increments. One shelter line failing, one bridge choking, one hospital locking a side door, one rumor causing 10,000 bad decisions. On the third day, the federal language hardened. Interstate movement restrictions, mandatory screening in several corridors, temporary suspension of some commercial transit, advisory against congregation at unsanctioned aid sites. That all sounded clean when read from a podium. On the ground, it meant families with a little gas left were suddenly trying to choose whether to burn it, finding back roads, or sit still and hope the official site ahead still existed by the time they reached it. Some towns started doing their own hard closures. You would roll into a parish road and find farm trucks parked across both lanes, men in work gloves and hunting vests standing with radios, telling outsiders there was no shelter there, and no fuel, and no room. Some were bluffing, some were telling the truth. Either way, rural self-protection had begun. I went south again because word came that New Orleans was now trying neighborhood-level isolation instead of mass shelter. That idea should have been there from the start, but the city had already spent 2 days pushing people towards centralized intake. By the time it reversed course, trust was wrecked. The Lower Garden District had apartment houses with signs in the window saying, "No cough cases." Mid-City had volunteer tables on corners handing out bleach solution instructions that were only partly useful because this thing was spreading through wet contact, close breath, panic, and enclosed air before people even hit the violent phase. In some blocks, neighbors were doing welfare checks by phone and yelling through doors instead of opening them. In others, the old reflex to crowd together was still winning, and that meant more cases. The hospital district was a fortress by then. Concrete barriers, armed troopers, separate ambulance routing, triage tents closed on 2 sides with negative pressure rigs where they could manage it. I spoke to a respiratory nurse outside a staff gate while she smoked with trembling hands under a no smoking sign. She said staff were now doing airway support in teams, with one person dedicated to watching for behavior change, not just oxygen numbers. Think about that. In a respiratory outbreak, they had to assign somebody whose whole job was to look for the second the patient stopped being a patient and became a physical threat. She said the worst part was not fear of dying. It was the feeling that care itself had become a risk vector. Every instinct the job taught her, lean in, soothe, get close, reassure, was now the wrong move with the wrong patient. We picked up the first solid international signal that afternoon. Not rumor, real clips. Marseille port delays tied to aggressive respiratory cases among disembarking passengers. Sao Paulo emergency wards overwhelmed by violent fever patients. Lagos officials denying broad transmission, while local crews filmed crowd disturbances outside clinics. A cargo vessel inbound from the Gulf, reporting multiple sick crew members and loss of onboard control in one compartment. That was when the story stopped being Louisiana plus spillover and turned into what it really was. A global transport disease with a short fuse, ugly symptoms, and social effects that outran clinical response. Once you know that, once you really know it, you stop waiting for outside rescue to arrive in a neat package. Outside is burning too. The station tried to pull me back to Baton Rouge headquarters after that, because they thought centralization of media staff might help preserve the broadcast. I refused. Not because I was brave, because the building itself no longer made sense to me. A newsroom is just another crowd once the separation problem beats the access control. Shared desks, shared restrooms, shared break room, air recycled through old units. Staff coming and going from the field with whatever they picked up at gas stations, hospitals, parking lots, roadside checks. If I was going to keep speaking, I wanted the truck. Doors I could lock, gear I understood, routes I could choose, fuel I could count. The truck was not safe, it was just honest. By then, food distribution had become as dangerous as medical intake. A school near Ascension Parish tried handing out meal boxes from the bus loop and got swamped by cars from 3 directions because word spread online before volunteers even finished unloading. I reached the site after the first push. Boxes torn open, milk cartons burst under tires, deputies trying to keep 2 lanes open for emergency vehicles, a pastor with a megaphone begging folks to back up because one of the volunteers had collapsed. Not turned aggressive, just collapsed from heat and stress. People are simple under pressure in one ugly way. If a place has water, food, fuel, medicine, or official vehicles, it becomes a magnet. The green flu did not just infect bodies, it infected logistics by forcing need into visible piles. There was a chemical spill rumor rolling at the same time, and I want to say this plain because bad information killed almost as much as the disease in some areas. Folks started claiming the aggression phase came from refinery gas, then from crop dusting, then from some failed riot agent, then from contaminated shelter meals. Those lies moved because they gave people something easier to hate than airborne or fluid spread they could not see. I drove by one roadblock where locals were turning away a tanker truck because somebody on a neighborhood page had said the truck was spraying the green flu into the air. It was hauling potable water. The driver had paperwork taped inside the windshield. Nobody cared. Fear had already decided what the truck meant. On the 4th morning, we hit the west side of the state because Lake Charles was now reporting industrial absentee spikes, shipping delays, and clusters at motel corridors where evacuee families had packed in after leaving the east. The interstate westbound had a different feel by then. Fewer people asking where to go. More people moving with a plan, even if it was a bad one. Pickups loaded high. Box trucks with mattresses tied inside. Boats being hauled inland by men who suddenly thought water distance would solve a respiratory problem. Some of that would work for a little while. A lot of it would fail the first time somebody got sick in close quarters, and the rest of the group hesitated too long because he was a brother or son or wife, and not yet a threat in their minds. Lake Charles had one of the roughest motel strips I saw in the whole first week. Families who could not reach Texas had taken rooms along the service roads. Hallways full of ice chests, laundry baskets, sleeping kids, cigarette smoke, bleach smell, and coughs behind thin doors. Management at one place had tried color-coded tape again. Green door if well, yellow if monitoring symptoms, red if no staff entry. People tore it down because nobody wanted the stigma of a red door, and nobody trusted the labels once they saw how fast a yellow room could turn. I filmed a manager standing in the lot with a baseball bat and a key ring the size of his fist, saying he had not slept in 30 hours because every noise upstairs sounded like somebody kicking through drywall. A sheriff's deputy out there told me the new nightmare was false wellness. A man or woman would hold together just long enough to pass a roadside check, reassure relatives, maybe even crack a joke, then crash violent in the exact place nobody could escape cleanly. Motel room, car, gas station restroom, hardware store aisle, church fellowship hall. The short fuse between visible decline and aggression made screening a partial answer at best. It was too dynamic, too dependent on timing, too easy to miss in a moving population. That deputy had started telling people not to ask only whether somebody looked sick. Ask whether he had been coughing green, sweating through clothes, staring off, breathing hard, getting strangely short or mean. Behavior history mattered as much as temperature by then. The first time I had to leave somebody behind because I knew helping up close would probably end with both of us dead or infected was outside Iowa, Louisiana, near a feeder road blocked by abandoned cars. A woman was pinned beside a sedan with her shin caught under a bumper. She was conscious and begging for help. Two men were trying to lift the car and failing. Her husband, I think, was inside the driver's seat, slumped against the horn with blood around his mouth and one arm twitching. The men shouted at me to help them move the vehicle. I got 3 steps closer, saw the husband's eyes open, saw that fixed stare, heard the rough pull in his chest, and stopped. I told them to get back. One did. One did not. The husband came out through the broken side window before the trapped woman finished her next sentence. I filmed none of that. I could not. Some things become so direct and so immediate that work falls out of your hands. I backed away, got in the truck and drove because the man who had stayed too close went down under both of them, and I knew there was no version of me with a camera battery and a pocket knife fixing that. The hardest lies people told during that week were not official lies. They were personal ones. I can still save him. She is still herself. We just need 1 more minute. Hold him down. She would never hurt me. That disease fed on ordinary love because ordinary love closes distance before the brain finishes calculating risk. By day 5, the state broadcast I was patched into had shifted from coverage to survival communication. Water boil notices where treatment plants were short-staffed, which bridges were open to emergency traffic only, which pharmacies were allowing curbside pickup and which had been emptied, which hospitals were diversion only, how to set up a sick room if you had no choice but to keep a symptomatic family member at home, masking, gloves, eye protection, dedicated waste bags, no shared utensils, no hugging through confusion no matter how much it hurt. I said that on air and had to stop for a second because even hearing my own voice say it felt wrong. No hugging through confusion. But wrong and necessary were living in the same room now. One county animal control officer called in from outside Alexandria and said he had been drafted into human containment because the catch poles and bite shields in his truck were suddenly more useful than half the medical gear local responders had. That sounds ugly. It was ugly. It was also practical. A lot of emergency work in the first week became a matter of adapting the tools actually on hand. School buses for isolation transport, warehouse goggles for face protection, marine radios when repeater coverage got patchy, construction fencing as temporary quarantine corridors, feed store gloves bought by the case, old hunting cabins turned into family separation points because they had standalone air and running water. The state was improvising not because it was clever, but because standardized plans had been written for calmer diseases. My truck became a rolling archive by then. Battery packs charging from the inverter. Memory cards and labeled sandwich bags. Maps marked with Sharpie where I knew fuel might still be found. Half-eaten crackers crushed into the floor mats. spare microphone wrapped in a t-shirt, scanner traffic hissing low while I talked. Every so often I would stop in some church lot or school lane long enough to upload footage if the network still held, then move again before the site drew too many people. That was another new rule. Visibility brought risk. If folks saw a marked news vehicle, some thought help had arrived. Others thought supplies had arrived. Others thought the government had sent a spy. All three reactions could get you boxed in. The federal screening zone near the state line toward Texas looked impressive from a distance. Flood towers, armored vehicles, med tents, helicopter traffic. It was still losing. Not from lack of force. From the fact that force does not produce clean families, clean histories, clean timing, or clean air. I watched one line of cars wait 3 hours to reach a tent where one sick child coughed all over the exam table. The mother panicked when they tried to separate him. The father swung on a medic, and the whole lane backed up while troopers pulled them apart. Behind that, hundreds of engines idled. Kids cried. Adults sweated through masks. Somebody threw up out a car door. All the inputs that made the line dangerous were being generated by the line itself. At some point during that 5th night, the station engineer told me the main transmitter could fail any time because staffing at the site was thin and refueling contracts were breaking down. He said if the tower dropped, audio would continue wherever the backup relay chain still held. I looked at the dark road ahead, then at the mic in my hand, and realized the form barely mattered anymore. Television, radio, stream, scanner patch, phone speaker in a motel bathroom, truck stereo in a line of evacuees. It was all the same act now. One human voice, putting verified pieces in order, while everything else came apart around it. I stopped worrying about sounding polished. Polished had no value left. Accurate did. I started getting more calls from ordinary people than from officials. A mechanic in Homa saying his shop had turned into a neighborhood repair point because everyone trusted him more than the parish bulletin. A grandmother in St. Bernard asking whether her son with cough but no aggression should be isolated in the shed. A nurse in Shreveport saying the north was not safe, only slower. A shrimper near Venice saying crews out on the water had started refusing new hands because one sick deckhand could wipe out a whole boat. A motel clerk in Lafayette saying he had 20 rooms and 37 people trying to rent them with cash and no identification because screening sites had failed them. That was the country inside the outbreak. People building tiny local systems because the big systems were already overloaded. The state finally admitted the case numbers were likely multiples higher than confirmed tallies. That should have been a shocking statement. By then, it just matched what everyone with eyes already knew. I had spent days filming overflow lots, closed pharmacy windows, bus lanes packed with coughing families, and roadside checks where medics had stopped pretending they could process the volume. The number that mattered was not the official infected count. It was the number of places where one bad turn could produce 10 new exposures before anyone reacted. Apartment stairwells, food lines, shared motel corridors, fuel queues, church basements, jail intake, nursing home halls, industrial break rooms. You did not need 1 million visible cases to wreck a state. You needed a few thousand in exactly the wrong kinds of spaces. On the 6th day, I made it back into New Orleans one last time, because reports said the downtown core was quieter. It was quieter. Quiet in the way a place gets after too many people have either fled, hidden, or learned not to open the door. Canal Street had fewer cars and more abandoned ones. Some storefronts were still intact. Some had been cleaned out. Streetcars stood dead in their tracks. I passed one block where a hotel had barricaded the revolving door with luggage carts and moved check-in under a side awning through one guarded point. I passed another where an apartment manager had posted floor-by-floor instructions telling tenants to signal wellness from windows at noon with white cloth and symptom need with red. Neighborhood systems again. Crude, direct, human. Near the river, I found a public school cafeteria being run by 6 women who had turned it into a neighborhood meal point, with strict spacing, masks, hand wash stations, and no indoor queue. They were doing a better job than some official sites had done, because they were dealing with a scale they could see. They knew the families. They knew who had a father coughing in the spare room. They knew who had lost a car and could not reach a pharmacy. They knew who was lying because they had known him 20 years. One of them told me the mistake at the beginning was trying to move everyone into large, supervised safety. She said large and safe had stopped going together the second aggression entered the picture. I put that on air almost word for word. That afternoon, a cargo ship sat offshore in the Gulf, waiting on clearance that was not coming because port staffing was broken, and half the dock roomers said the crew had sick men below. Helicopters moved over the river. Sirens still rose and fell, though less often. Less traffic does not mean less suffering. It often means people have learned there is nobody left worth calling. I parked under an overpass long enough to clean the windshield and wipe dried grime off the camera body, and realized my hands were shaking harder than they had the first day. Not from one big emotional collapse, just accumulated load. Days of watching ordinary spaces become contact traps. Days of hearing officials catch up to scenes I had already left behind. Days of knowing every helpful crowd was one symptom away from becoming a hazard. By the 7th day, there were still hospitals operating, still parishes with order, still neighborhoods feeding each other, still troopers on roads, still medics showing up. I want that clear. This was not the world ending in one sweep. It was the world thinning out in the places where trust and distance could not both survive. Some communities adapted faster and bought themselves time. Some buildings got the separation right and kept functioning. Some families isolated early and stayed alive. But the broad public idea that there would be one announcement, one cordon, one convoy, one cure path, that died in Louisiana before the week was over. The green flu spread too fast through the structures we used to save each other. I am talking now from the truck parked on high ground west of Baton Rouge, with enough fuel for a little while, food for a little while, batteries for a little while, and more footage than I know what to do with if there is ever a clean place left to put it. I have seen shelters break, roadblocks fail, hospitals harden, churches improvise, schools adapt, and whole families torn in half by the gap between symptom and violence. I have seen lies from officials and lies from frightened husbands, and lies from people who needed their sick loved one to stay ordinary for just 5 more minutes. I have also seen nurses hold lines they had no business being asked to hold. Troopers keep order in masks soaked through with sweat. Neighbors build better systems in one block than a state built in one convention hall. If you are hearing me and you still have choices, make them small and local and real. Fewer people, more air. Separate early. Protect eyes, mouth, hands. Do not build your plan around a crowded route to safety, because the route is part of the danger now. Do not wait for somebody coughing green and breathing hard to prove he is dangerous with your skin. Do not confuse love with distance being unnecessary. Do not trust numbers that sound tidy if the street outside your window is telling you something else. Keep water. Keep fuel if you can. Keep one room for separation if you have the space. Keep your people calm. Crowds are where this thing gets rich. What happened here did not start with monsters. It started with bus riders, shelter cots, tired nurses, packed apartment halls, worried parents, delayed statements, and ordinary people trying to do ordinary things in close quarters, while a bad disease moved faster than the rules around it. That is why it spread so hard. It wore the face of daily life until the second it did not. I filmed the first curb in New Orleans because I was sent out to cover a rough sickness story. A week later, I am still talking because there are people alive tonight who need the plain version more than they need comfort. The plain version is this. The routes meant to save us helped move it. The places meant to protect us sometimes fed it. The only ground that stayed solid was ground somebody could actually control. I do not know what the next week looks like. I know what the first one was. It was green spit on concrete outside a bus terminal. It was medics slipping in hospital tile while a restrained man tore loose. It was mothers covering coughing children in screening lanes, and fathers lying to troopers because separation felt worse than risk. It was fans blowing bad air through convention lines. It was motel hallways, church cots, fuel queues, bridge approaches, school meal pickups, airport sidewalks, and roadside checks. It was every weak point in shared life getting tested all at once. If you still have room to move, move smart. If you cannot move, reduce contact and lock your routine down. Do not wait for a perfect instruction set. None is coming. I am going to keep talking as long as the power chain holds and the truck can still run the chargers. If the picture drops, the picture drops. The words matter more now anyway. Louisiana was not taken in one blow. It was taken site by site, lane by lane, room by room, by a sickness people kept trying to treat as familiar because unfamiliar was too hard to accept. Do not make that mistake where you are. Believe what crowded spaces are telling you. Believe what hospitals are telling you when the doors harden. Believe your local nurse before you believe a polished podium 10 hours behind. The first week is over here. The crisis is not.